This is a screencast regarding Coas, Demsetz, and the externality debate, or the unending externality debate. You have to forgive me if I butcher all of these names. This is largely intended to give political science students a slight background in the economic debate surrounding externalities. So these are going to be, in many ways, fancy terms that really have fairly straightforward meanings. For those of you who are interested in more information, I've given you the Cato Journal that has more detail on many of these things and, importantly, citation information for many of these articles. So if you're interested in more details, then you can go to this Cato Journal or search any major database for articles surrounding this. Let's talk about the historical background for this debate. A.C. Pigou is a very famous economist who really brought externalities into the sort of the broader intellectual world. He noted the danger of an externality, which would be when you impose costs of one person onto another, or the imposition of costs by person A onto person B, which he argued required government regulation. The classic example of this would be the owner of a factory who makes a product, makes money off that product, and then pollutes the water as he makes the product. He gets the benefit, but everyone else in the community suffers the cost for that because they are the ones who suffer from the contaminated water. So the question is, when you have an externality of that sort, then what happens? How do you respond to that? And Pigou argues that this is going to be, the answer is found in government regulation. It's worth noting that Pigou is mainly concerned with what would be called negative externalities, when I push the cost onto someone else and then take the benefits myself. But many economists have later on noticed that actually there are such things as positive externalities, and this is oftentimes found in trade. So for example, I cannot afford to eat at fancy restaurants very often, but the fact that other people can means that when I do want to go out and eat well once every year or so, why, the restaurants are there for me. I am basically enjoying positive externalities from having very wealthy people living in the same city as I do. So Pigou was mainly focusing on the negative externalities and then looking at government to help resolve that problem. Now, Coas argued that Pigou was not really quite thinking deeply enough. He argues that bargaining can in fact give an efficient outcome regardless of the initial allocation of property rights. And I wrote all of that out because it's, I suppose, much more complicated than it needs to be. But there are basically two important things to note in this, in his argument. The first is Coas basically begins by noting the importance of transaction costs. So he says, even if I am given all of the toys, as it were, in the room, if I can make trades with all of everyone else in the room, then we'll eventually come to an efficient outcome. But that assumes that there are low transaction costs. If I have a baseball card that is worth $50, but it costs $30 in order to do the transaction, I'm much less likely to sell my baseball card. So Coas noted that you can get an efficient outcome with bargaining, but it assumes that there are low transaction costs. And it also, the other issue that you can oftentimes run into is when you have poorly defined property rights. If I don't know or trust that when I give you $50 for your baseball card that I will be able to keep that baseball card, then I'm not going to purchase your baseball card. So trades usually require low transaction costs and solidly defined property rights. We have to trust that we will be able to keep what we have purchased. So these are two important names, Pigou and Coas, and that's sort of what sets the stage for the debate, the modern debate on externalities. So let's talk about some modern controversies. Modern economists redefined Coas himself. It's worth noting that the Coas theorem was not named by Coas. It was named by a more modern economist named Stiglitz. And Stiglitz increasingly argued that any transaction cost in the marketplace required government intervention. They would just simply note any transaction had a cost to it. They argued that the cost was creating inefficiencies, and therefore these inefficiencies required government interaction. It is really important to note that this is much further than Coase went. Coase himself understood that government had lots of transaction costs, but people who came after Coase didn't pay quite as much attention to Coase himself. They took what they wanted and sort of ignored the rest. And so as a result, modern economists typically ignored government transaction costs whenever they argued for regulation. They argued that marketplace had transaction costs which created inefficiencies. Well, there we go, obvious solution, government steps in. But they sort of ignored the fact that government is not a terribly efficient way of doing things. That leads us to an economist named Demsetz. And Demsetz began to say, wait a minute, this doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense here. And so what Demsetz began to argue was that unified ownership theoretically could eliminate many of these supposed externalities. So for example, if I own a coal-burning factory, then and it's causing coal to fall on the farmer's cropland adjacent to my factory, there's an easy way to get rid of that externality. I could simply buy the farmland and the externality disappears. So unified ownership theoretically could eliminate these externalities. That means that most, or at least many, supposed externalities are actually a result of increased specialization. These are not transaction costs, they're simply a result of our modern economy and the increasing specialization. But what do you do about these costs that are imposed or passed along to the farmer? How do you deal with that? And Demsetz noted that unilateral self-help could avoid social costs. To use the coal example, the farmers could simply, say, put up a big tarp over the farm, or they could blow the soot off the crops. They could take care of these problems themselves. It required some work on for the farmers, but it would avoid, or it could eliminate, these social costs. Now it's worth noting, well, let's just do this, some quick conclusions that this has led to. The first is to realize that transaction costs refer to any cost of interaction between economic actors. And particularly since some economists named Tulloch and Buchanan wrote about this, everyone has realized that actually there are really straightforward reasons why political or government actors will always have high transaction costs. Another important thing to remember is that government redistribution of rights will undermine or could undermine property rights for all. Oftentimes, those who are concerned with social justice issues would see the answer as simply redistributing those rights from those who are disliked to those who need help. But the concern is that if you did that, you could undermine rights for everyone. So, for example, let's say Microsoft is viewed as creating or having a monopoly position, and so we have decided that we are simply going to penalize Microsoft. We're going to force them to pay a great fine simply because they have obtained too much market share. Well, in that case, then any software company who conceivably then gain too much market share would also be potentially exposed to huge fines. So that would be an example of how government redistribution of rights in one situation sets a precedent that could undermine the rights for everyone. Third, some harms still require government intervention. Except for a few purists, most people would say that there are still harms that require government intervention, and these harms are more typically found when externalities affect a greater number of people. So, for example, to go back to the coal factory example, Oftentimes coal-fired plants would have not just affected the farmland around it, but would have also affected those who breathed the coal dust that would have been in the air. And so now all of a sudden you're talking about a factory that's not just affecting a few farmers, but is potentially affecting the health of all those in the surrounding area. And at that point you could potentially be talking about an externality that would be large enough to justify government regulation. And then finally, if government should not replace markets, why should it replace management? The lesson that most economists have taken from analyzing the Soviet Union is that it turns out that central planning just doesn't tend to work very well. Very difficult for any politician, no matter how wise, to be able to obtain as much information as the marketplace naturally passes along. So if it turns out to be the case that politicians are actually not able to replace the markets, why should we expect that they could manage the marketplace better than those within the marketplace could itself? And again, these are not necessarily questions that I would give you, say there's an obvious answer for, but they're intended to give you a question that hopefully gives you something to think about.